My name is Dan Samuels. I'm the Director of Public Programs here at the Weitzman National Museum of American Jewish History. Our purpose at the Weitzman is to connect Jews more closely to their heritage and to inspire people of all backgrounds a greater appreciation for the diversity of the American Jewish experience and the freedoms to which Americans aspire. Professor Roy Salomon is a full professor of cognitive neuroscience at the University of Haifa. His research primarily explores perceptual consciousness and bodily self-consciousness, utilizing advanced techniques such as virtual reality, computational models, and neuroimaging. He earned his PhD in cognitive neuroscience from Tel Aviv University and the Weizmann Institute of Science, no relation, and completed postdoctoral training at EPFL in Switzerland, focusing on neuroscience of consciousness and self. Professor Salomon has made significant contributions to understanding non-typical states of consciousness, such as those experienced in psychosis and under psychedelics. His research is known for innovative approach to empirically studying the neurocognitive mechanisms underlying big questions like what is the self and how do we know what is real. In addition to these academic achievements, and more specifically related to today's presentation, Professor Salomon is co-founder and board member of SafeHeart, a nonprofit NGO in Israel dedicated to assisting trauma survivors, particularly those affected by the terror attack on the Supernova Music Festival, which began on the morning of October 7th, 2023. The tragic event provided a unique opportunity to study trauma processing under altered states of consciousness, an area where Professor Salomon's work is pioneering. Professor Salomon's experience working at the intersection of trauma and psychedelics put him in a very unique position to help the survivors of the Nova Festival, as well as their families and communities, beginning to heal and help them begin to heal over the last 16 months. Further, his efforts in this field aim to offer new insights and potential therapeutic approaches for treating trauma and related mental health conditions. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Dan. Hello, everyone. I'm Roy. And today I'm going to tell you about this tragic and crazy journey that personally I've gone through, that we've gone through as a country over the past 14 months or so. And I'll tell you both my personal story, kind of as an intro as how it happened, how I happened to be in this intersection where I got involved in what happened. I'm not an expert on trauma. Unfortunately, now I am an expert on trauma. I was forced into this, but typically in my lab studies consciousness, self-consciousness. And when all this started, I knew very little of trauma. But what happened is that on October 7th, like most people in Israel, and I think many people around the world, I was dumbfounded to see how my country was being overrun by terrorists, and things and images that I would never imagine of seeing in Israel were being on TV. The pickups, the shootings, and the general kind of collapse of our ability to protect the people. And like many Israelis, I felt that I had to do something. I had to act in some way and help, but it was not clear to me how. I called up my army unit and they said, don't call us, we'll call you. And I was sitting at home and kind of going crazy. And then sometime around noon, I got a message on one of the groups I'm in saying that people from the Nova Party, and there are several parties around Gaza at the time, but we'll use kind of the name Nova to mention them, to denote them all. People from the party are arriving at hospitals, and beyond having serious injuries, they are also, many of them are in altered states of consciousness. And the staff at the hospital doesn't know really what to do in this situation. And would someone come down, maybe try to help out? And immediately 2 people volunteered to go down. But for me, it was kind of an aha moment in which I realized how I could help, what maybe my role is in this. So being a researcher, I've been worked on altered states of consciousness, on psychedelics for a long time. And in recent years, when psychedelics have been kind of suggested as a way to maybe help people get through trauma or overcome other mental health difficulties, I've been studying that a bit. So I knew many, many people who were interested in psychedelics and how they can help treat trauma. And then I said, well, you know, the survivors of this party, of the Nova Festival, There are going to be thousands of survivors. And they are going to be in a crazy state that we never encountered before. Never before in his recorded history do we have an event in which such a mass terror event with so much trauma and so much damage has occurred to people, many of whom, as happens at these festivals, were in altered states of consciousness. And to me, this was really a moment where I understood maybe how I can help. And what I did is I called up a few of my friends that work in harm reduction. I'm also a person who frequents these kinds of music festivals. And sometimes what we do is we have a harm reduction tent. We have a tent where people they're going through something which is too intense, they can come over and they can sit it out, and we kind of help them emerge from this event unscathed. And I called them up and said, listen, we have to organize something. And they said, sure, we're with you on this. And I sent out a message asking on one of these groups, if you're a clinician who understands trauma, understands psychedelics, and you want to help the survivors of the Nova Party, please sign in on this form. So we had a Google form. And within 2 hours, we had 50 clinicians volunteering to do pro bono work with the survivors. And I said, okay, so we have some clinicians. What's the next step? And in the morning of the 8th, we put up a website. It was terrible looking. I designed it. It was really terrible looking. But it just said, if you're at the parties and you feel you need help, we're here for you. And just put in your details and we'll get back to you. And to be completely honest, I thought we'd maybe have 80 or 100 responders. But at the end of the first day, we had 300 people signing up for help. And the next day, we had another 350 people signing up for help. And then we understood that we have to deal with something which is much bigger than what we thought. And overall, over 2,300 people registered for help. And this is how what we call SafeHeart, which is the organization that we formed. It's an NGO, it's a nonprofit that it basically aims to allow the people who are at the parties to get help for free from trained clinicians who understand both trauma very well, because trauma is something that you have to have great expertise in, but also understand psychedelics. Because for many people, this was a very unique situation. And for many people coming out of the parties, they came and some of them met very good clinicians. But if these clinicians were not open and were not kind of non-judgmental about the state that people were in, for instance, using LSD or using other types of psychedelics, then these people tended to kind of bottle up and not be able to open up. And the beginning of the therapeutic process was not done properly. So this is how we opened SafeHeart. There were several of us that co-founded this, and we did this kind of out of the garage in my house during crazy days on the 7th and the 8th. And what we did is we brought people from all over Israel, survivors who needed help, and we matched them up with clinicians who volunteered to help them. And yeah, so that's what I've been doing for the past year or so. And SafeHeart has turned out to be it's really grown because there's a lot of need. So we had over 2,000 survivors receiving acute interventions, because what we know is the best way to kind of not have people get PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, is by doing a very rapid intervention, very rapidly after the trauma. In the same way that, you know, if you have a car accident, people tell you, well, you should start driving again as soon as possible. So we gave these interventions, over 2,000 of them at the beginning, more or less 6 treatments that were just the idea was to give an acute intervention. But then we figured out that it makes no sense that if we already have survivors meeting clinicians and starting this clinical bond with them, for them to go out and look for other clinicians in Israel, where the need for mental aid has been huge over the past year and a half, makes no sense. So we went out and got some philanthropic money. The government at this point was not helping us yet, but we got some money from many Jewish communities in the States, actually. And this allowed us to give long-term treatment to the survivors. So we have over 1,000 survivors who are getting long-term treatment. This means 36 or 48 sessions with clinicians. Now, we're of course paying the clinicians. No one expects anyone to do 48, almost a year's treatment for free. We have over 380 psychedelic-informed clinicians, so we've become one of the largest mental health organizations in Israel over less than a year. We didn't exist a year ago. Over almost 30,000 hours of therapy have been given since the 8th of October. We've also given a lot of psychiatric treatment because in Israel now, if you're looking for a psychiatrist, you might wait for over 6 months. And if you need a psychiatrist, that is way, way too long. So we have a full-time psychiatrist that the organization pays for, who deals just with people from the Nova and helps them out. And we also have group therapy programs all across Israel. You have to remember the survivors. We have survivors in Metulan, we have survivors in Eilat, so it's all across Israel. We have to basically find solutions for people everywhere. So we've opened these group therapy programs for people that this works for. Group therapy is not for everyone who has trauma. It's helpful for some people and not helpful for others. And we've also had retreats where people have joined. And we've also been treating family and spouses. We've discovered from our work with the survivors, we've discovered the grave need of the family and spouses, both in treating and also understanding how to work with the survivors themselves. So SafeHeart has been a huge organization, a huge effort, and it's maybe the most important thing I've done in my life, except for my own children. And basically, SafeHeart, the first thing we do is the clinical treatment. This is the most important part. But also, we've been very active in doing legislature, because in Israel, the country was not prepared for this, and they didn't really not know how to act. So we've been working in the Knesset and making sure that the survivors get the care they need. And the last part is research. Being a researcher, we very early on, we understood that we're facing something which is completely novel, never happened before. And while we know a lot about trauma and how to treat trauma, we have no idea what happens to people who experience trauma under the influence of mind-altering substances. Okay? So basically, this has been the knowledge gap that we identified, and we already started at the end of October. So since I don't understand very much about trauma, I joined forces with a good friend of mine, Professor Roy Salomon, who is an expert on PTSD and stress. And we joined together with SafeHeart on the other side. And we have a very special program. We have over 30 students working on this. We just kind of joined together our labs and threw everyone, no matter what they were previously doing, into this project. And since the survivors have a difficult time to travel, they're very afraid to travel to other places, especially at the beginning. So unlike how we typically work where people come to our lab, we opened pop-up labs in 6 different cities in Israel. This also for us was a very, very different way than we're used to working. And we've had more than 1,250 survivors participating in our study. Just to give you an estimate, that's about between 1/4 and 1/3 of all the survivors in the festival. So we have a very large cohort of survivors that have worked with us. And just to say something really important, the study community working with the survivors has been amazing. They are so brave and so smart and so funny. And I've had so many days where I sit there and they're laughing and I'm crying because their stories are crazy. But we've also had like another fringe benefit, which has been very interesting to us. So, to me, it was amazing that they came out. Why are you coming to study? You just went through this crazy trauma. Why did you come and do this? And they said, first thing they say, and almost all of them say this, that what we went through is so crazy that we're so happy that someone is actually studying this, because this has to be studied. And the second thing is that they're so happy that maybe something that they're doing can actually help someone else in their predicament. So really amazing, amazing people. Okay, and the main idea here is how can the knowledge we gain within science inform therapy and in the other way direction. So we have regular meetings with the therapist in SafeHeart, and they transfer their clinical knowledge to us, what they're seeing in the clinics, and we say what we're seeing at the science level, and hopefully we're trying to help each other do both better. Okay. So I think the main question here that we're trying to address is what happens when you actually experience this kind of horrific trauma in a special state of consciousness, which is not your typical state of consciousness. Okay. Now, first of all, let's talk a little bit about trauma. What is trauma? So first of all, trauma is defined as exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. This is from the DSM. This is how trauma is defined. Recently, they've also added what we call criterion A. So this happened after 9/11, when many people were very traumatized by watching the towers collapse. But they said, well, it still matters if you were actually there or not. So we have what's called criterion A. Were you in direct, actual situation in which you faced like a fear of death? Okay, I did that because watching it on TV is still can be very traumatic, but it's still something which is very different. So this is how we define a traumatic event. And many of us, almost all people, will go through some traumatic event during their lifetime. It can be the passing of a loved one. This can be a natural disaster. But the two most dangerous traumatic events to mental health actually come, by far the most dangerous is sexual violence. And the second is interpersonal violence. So we know that going through interpersonal violence or sexual violence, which are both kind of happen between people, leave much, much worse mental outcomes, mental health outcomes than natural disasters. Because there's something about these situations in which you lose trust with the people around you. Okay? So even though most people will have at least one traumatic event during their lifetime, then the question is what happens after this traumatic event? Okay, so what we're actually really afraid of is this. This is what we call post-traumatic related psychopathologies. Many people, after undergoing serious trauma, will show different rates of either depression or anxiety disorders. And I think most classically is what we call PTSD, is post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a very special, unique type of mental disorder. And tragically, it's also very, very chronic and very difficult to get rid of. Okay? So what typically happens is once a traumatic event happens, for instance, what happened on the 7th October, most people show a similar reaction. Almost all of us, including me, and I was not in Gaza and I was not in direct threat to my life, we show different levels of what we call traumatic stress. We go through nightmares, we don't sleep well, we are so hyper arousal, so every small noise makes us jump. And this is a very typical, and it's almost, we think it's also even a healthy reaction to the situation, okay? So basically we see this rise kind of in these traumatic stress, okay? We're going through these stressful symptoms, okay? And the people who are resilient, what happens is these kind of plateau over time and then go down, okay? So it's very normal to have all these symptoms at the beginning, but what distinguishes people who will and will not have PTSD is what happens later. Do these symptoms eventually subside? You have some recovery, or do they become chronic? And basically people who have chronic PTSD, this goes on for the rest of their lives. And just to show kind of what they're going through, these are the symptoms. So they don't like thinking or talking about the trauma. They're hypervigilant. They're very easy to scare. They have a negative mood. They're always on guard because they don't really feel that the world is a safe place. They feel the world is a very different, very dangerous place. So they avoid going to anything which might remind them of the trauma or any activity. Critically, they also have flashbacks. Flashbacks in PTSD they're really hallucinations. People are taken back and they re-experience this event again and again. And that's something really terrible, because if you think of going through something so traumatic, re-experiencing it again and again and again on a daily basis is hell. So the lives of these people suffering from chronic PTSD is very, very bad. And it's not marked here, but both substance abuse, which is marked here, and also suicide are very, very common with people who have PTSD. So the first thing we want to do in SafeHeart, and also what we want to do in our studies, is see how we can avoid people getting into this post-traumatic stress disorder. So what's special about having this trauma under mind-altering substances? So just to say, the way most trauma studies are done, I didn't know this before I started studying this, is most trauma studies are done on people who have car accidents, and they get to the hospital, and so you had an accident, they say, okay, do you want to be part of the study? And people say, okay. And this is, so most people that we study for trauma are people who had car accidents who were not hospitalized for more than 24 hours. This means that they even did not have major injuries. Now, car accidents can be very, very traumatic. And yet you think that many of these people are probably not undergoing very serious trauma. If you compare this to terror attacks, sexual abuse, or kind of very serious traumatic events. Okay? And I think what's very special about this trauma, the specific trauma that happened at the Nova, is that these people were in a very special state of mind where they came to party and enjoy themselves, and they were very trusting. They were trusting to the point where they allowed themselves to be in other altered states of consciousness and relax their guard. And when you use mind-altering substances and go into altered states of consciousness, basically you experience things differently. Okay? Now, there are many different types of substances and many different types of substances that were used at the party. Okay, I'm not going to put anyone on the spot and ask you how well you know these substances, but basically we can kind of group them. For instance, LSD, mescaline, DMT, and psilocybin are what we call psychedelics. They create hallucinations. Most of them work on serotonin, which is a neurotransmitter naturally occurring in the brain, and specifically they target the 5-HT2A receptors. And they cause hallucinations. They cause very profound changes in the sense of self. And we're kind of bunching them together, but to be honest, most of the people in the party used LSD among all these. We also have MDMA. MDMA is not really a psychedelic, but rather it's an empathogen. It causes, when people take it at parties, it causes a sense of euphoria, a reduction of negative feelings. It's a very pro-social substance, causes people to feel loved and to give love to others. But it's not really psychedelic, does not create any hallucinations. We also have substances like cocaine and amphetamines, which are stimulants. They typically target the dopaminergic system, and they cause you to have a lot of energy. And we also have substances like THC, for marijuana, or ethanol, which is alcohol, booze, which people also take at these parties. And they can act sometimes as downers, so they kind of suppress the nervous system a little bit. They have different mechanisms. And the only one which is actually legal in Israel is alcohol. Many states I know in Israel now allow weed as well. Okay. Now, one of the thoughts we had is, in recent years, psychedelics, and especially MDMA, have been suggested as a possible mechanism to help people who already have PTSD. So what happens is MDMA-assisted psychotherapy has been suggested and been tested recently, rejected for strange reasons by the FDA, or they want more evidence. But basically what happens is people go to a pair of psychologists and clinicians, and with the clinicians, the patients take MDMA, and this allows them to actually kind of look back into their trauma and address their trauma without getting too agitated. And through re-experiencing their trauma with clinicians while being assisted by MDMA, there's actually great results, and they show that even people who have chronic PTSD for 10 or 20 years, this can really elevate their symptoms. Okay, so this is kind of idea that we had coming in, that maybe, but we're not quite sure, since these different substances have very different effects. It was not quite sure what are the consequences of trauma experience under psychoactive substances, and will different psychoactive substances have different effects. Okay, so this is kind of what we did in the project. We have a general cohort of over 1,000 people who kind of fill in questionnaires, and then we also have a depth cohort who come into the lab, and we do imaging with them, and we give them sports watches. I hope I'll have some time to talk about that later today. And we also have a control group for people who also frequent festivals and went to parties on the same day, but not near Gaza. So they were not directly affected by the traumatic events. Okay. And right now I'm going to talk to you about what work we've done in the peri-traumatic period. This is the first 4 months, which is kind of when the processing of trauma is beginning and being formed. So I want to just address a few limitations, which are important. As scientists, we have to always know what we don't know. So first of all, this is a natural experiment, in the sense that typically when I do experiments, I control all the factors. And here I controlled none of the factors. Okay, what happened, happened. We're also not going to replicate this experiment. So we have to work with what actually happened with no control over dosing, what people took, what they did. Almost everything we're doing here is off subjective reports. We also have some objective measures, but we ask people how they're feeling, how they're doing, okay? And I believe them. The results we're showing do not reflect final clinical outcomes. many of these people are still processing the trauma, so they may have very high symptoms now and may recover later. And some people may be okay now and later show much more symptoms. This is also something that happens sometimes. We should also kind of address the fact that probably survivors with very severe symptoms are underrepresented here because they don't leave home to come to the study. Coming to be part of the research still requires some energy, and people who are doing very, very badly probably don't have that energy. And finally, we have a very serious survivor bias, in the true sense that we do not know anything about the people who were killed at the party, and we only know what the survivors can tell us. So these are the serious limitations we have. So just basically on the design, what we did is in the weeks following the attack, we contacted whoever we could, through different groups, through SafeHeart, through Facebook, and we asked them about what happened during the traumatic event, what happened when they got home. And we looked at different factors that we know are important for PTSD, like guilt and how much social support you have and how in control you felt. And finally, at the end, we looked at their current clinical state using K6, which is a questionnaire looking at mental distress, PCL, which measures post-traumatic symptoms. And we asked them directly, how overwhelmed do you feel right now? Okay. So in this part of the study, we had 772 participants, 487 males. This is about 22% of the survivors. And just if we discussed before what trauma exposure is like, then 100% of this cohort it directly experienced life-threatening events. This is criterion A. 83% witnessed dead or injured individuals. 80% reported that they had loved ones who were murdered. And 69% reported they had loved ones who were injured. Okay, so these people went through extended trauma for many hours of the highest possible level of exposure. Okay, and when we looked at what kind of substances people took, and I think we were in a very unique position here that they trusted us enough to tell us that they took different substances, including ones which are illegal. We found something that was not surprising to us because we know these types of people, that 68% consumed some substance or another. And this is what they consumed. Now, I know this is confusing. I put it here because the reality is confusing. Participants did not think we would be doing a study on this and did not take into account that it would be much nicer if they only used one substance, and they did what people do at these types of parties, and they did multi-substance or polysubstance use. So you can have here, you see there are people that only used MDMA or only used hallucinogens or only used cannabis or alcohol. But you see all the possible mixtures, including 2 people who actually took cannabis, hallucinogens, MDMA, and stimulants. Okay, so just analytically to say this is very difficult to tease apart, but I think this is, it's part of working with real world data. So what we did is we tried to look, first of all, at people who only used one substance. We've also analyzed all the interactions, but I'll put that aside for now. So we have about 260 people who did not use anything. We have 68 people who used cannabis or alcohol. 99 used only MDMA, and 84 used only hallucinogens. So this is kind of looking only at the purest forms. I can tell you that the mixtures are quite similar. Now, when we looked at when people took the substances, we see also something we expected is that most people tried to time the peak of the substance effect at the sunrise, which is the moment of when the party or the festival typically peaks. So this is looking back, 70% took this within 3 hours of sunrise. And of course, 6:29 was the moment when the attack actually started. So here, this was probably the worst possible moment to have a peak experience. So when we looked, first of all, during the trauma exposure, the first thing we asked them is, did you feel that the substance you took helped or hindered you in surviving? And here we already got a very, very surprising response. And I'll show you how to read these graphs so you'll understand what I'm showing. So each dot here is a person, is a response of a single person. And you can see there's a large spread of different responses. This is very important to understand. So for instance, this person in the cannabis alcohol group felt that it hindered him. This was not good for him. While there's another person in this group that felt that it helped him a lot. But what we do in science here is we're looking at the group average. This is this diamond shape here. And what we can see here is that for both MDMA and for hallucinogens, these people felt that it actually helped them survive, while for the cannabis and alcohol group did not feel that the substance helped them survive. Now, straight out of the box, this was very surprising because I think no one would think that being on LSD during a terror attack is something which is helpful. So I just want to say that we're not saying in any case that this is objectively helpful. We're thinking that this is what people feel. I don't know if this actually helped them or was not good for them, but many people are telling us that they felt they had almost mystical experiences of how they survived this. So even if it did not objectively help them today to survive PTSD, the narrative is actually what's important. And if you feel that what you did was good and helpful to you, that's very helpful in your recovery. Okay. Now we also looked at feelings of control, and there was actually no difference between the groups, and feelings of isolation. So these are two things that we thought but did not show any effects. But we went to the peri-traumatic processing. So we asked them, when you got home, what did you feel like socially? And we saw here a very, very strong effect that people who took MDMA reported that they had many more social interactions when they got home. And this is in line with the pro-social effects of MDMA, which are well known. And we know that social interactions are very, very important for recovery. Not only that, people who took MDMA also reported much, much better sleep, even better than people who took nothing at the party. And you can also see that people in the alcohol and cannabis group actually had worse sleep than people who took nothing at the party. So it seems a little bit like people who took MDMA maybe had some kind of protective effect from the MDMA, and people who actually were drinking and smoking weed had some detrimental effect on their outcomes. Moreover, when we look at their clinical state, then when we looked at how, we asked them directly how overwhelmed they feel, then clearly you can see the MDMA group is showing the best results. It's better than all the other groups and even better than the what we call no-use group. And when we look at the mental distress, you can see that the MDMA group is reporting the lowest levels of mental distress, lower than the no-use group. And again, here, the cannabis and alcohol group are actually showing higher levels of mental distress than all the other groups and higher than people who took nothing. And when we look at the PTSD symptoms, we can look at the PCL, then we see here that the MDMA are the lowest. However, this is not significantly different than no use, even though it is better than cannabis and better than hallucinogens. But we can see that cannabis and alcohol are actually doing worse. They are showing the highest level of symptoms. Just to kind of give you an idea, you see this line here? This is the clinical cutoff for having PTSD. So about 60% of our cohort are above this clinical cutoff. Okay? These people are not doing well. Okay? So here we can see kind of what is the probability of having a favorable outcome over the different things that I told you about now. And just in a glance, you can see that over almost all our measures, the MDMA group here marked in this red have the best outcomes, and almost everywhere the worst outcome is for the people who took cannabis and alcohol. Surprising being the two substances that are most widely used, and one of them which is actually legal. Okay. So kind of the interim conclusions, we saw a putative protective effect of MDMA during the peri-traumatic period, and we saw harmful effects of cannabis and alcohol in this period. Okay, but I want to remind you, this is not a clinical trial. We still have a lot of work to do before we can actually try to use these insights to treat people. Okay, and this work has been covered by the New York Times and many different papers. I think it's really in the public eye. Many people are very, very interested in this. Okay, I'm going to take a few minutes also to kind of give you a little bit of a feeling for what else we've been doing. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit of what we're doing in a bit further down after 4 months after the traumatic event. And I think one of the most interesting things we've done is that we've given over 250 people, 250 survivors and another 100 controlled people, a sports watch to take home for a month. And I think what this wearable sensor is amazing for is that, like many of us, when we come to an exam, then we try to bring on our best side and we really make an effort to kind of show that we're doing well. But when you take something home and records your sleep patterns and your heart rate, you can't fake that. So we're kind of getting a more objective measure of how these people are doing, irrespective if they want to tell us that they're doing okay, and many of them try to put on a brave face, we can actually see what they're actually doing. And just to show you here, this is kind of sleep. All this black is sleep. So this is one survivor's sleep over 21 days. And you can see, like many of us, this person sleeps kind of from 11 to about 7 o'clock, had a nap here once. You can see that the stability of their sleep between days is very, very stable. And you can see this very clear pattern. This is another survivor, and you can see here that this person sometimes sleeps during the night, sometimes during the day, and this pattern seems to change every day between days. And we know this is something which is strongly related to PTSD. So when we looked at this across participants, we found a very strong effect that survivors had much lower sleep stability than control participants, and this was correlated to their level of symptoms. So the worse sleep stability you have, the more PTSD symptoms you have. And even when we compared the controls to survivors who had PTSD and survivors who didn't have PTSD, we could see a difference between those three groups. Meaning that from a sports watch, it costs about $100 now, from far away, we can actually predict what's going to happen to people in the sense of how bad their PTSD is. And this is very, very important for us. We've also done brain imaging with these people. This is amazing work by my PhD, Ophir. And what we've done, we brought them in. We've done several things. I'm going to talk mainly about, we showed them a movie here from other festivals, not from the Nova Festival, which we kind of used as a stressor, a bit of a reminder of the previous state. And just to say, data collection was quite complex because we did this, it's a multi-center site, both in the Weizmann and in Haifa. But not only was it difficult because we did in two different centers, it was also very difficult because of the type of population we use. So the MRI scanners, they don't like two things. They don't like metal, like piercing, and they don't like tattoos. And if there's one thing that the people at these parties have a lot of is piercing and tattoos. So we actually had a medic there whose job was to remove tattoos, remove piercing from people. Sometimes this took like 45 minutes before they even started the scan. You can see here that we've had 136, which is a huge number for fMRI people scanned over the past year. And again, the most common substance use was no use, MDMA and hallucinogens. And you can see here that both in PCL and K6, the people from the experiment group are doing worse, which is expected. Now, what we looked at is when they're watching this movie, how similar is the activity in their brains? And what we thought is that within people who underwent this trauma, this reminder of what it's like to be at a party will cause their brains to actually look more different, to activate in very different ways. Because people in the control group, they'll say, okay, now it's a party, and they look at it and the brain will work in a very similar manner. But people who have different traumatic reactions will show more variability in how their brains are working. And indeed, this is what we looked at. We used a measure called inter-subject correlation. So basically, you can see here, this is how correlated are the brains of different people while watching this movie. So first of all, overall, you can see that between the experiment group and the control group, it's kind of similar. We see this is a visual area. So unsurprisingly, when you're watching a movie, the visual area works very similar between different people. But overall, you can see the pattern is rather similar. But when we look at the differences between the groups, that we can see that indeed the control group have much more similarity across many regions of the brain than the experimental group. Okay, so they're responding in a more typical manner, and the experimental group are kind of going all over the place. Except for one region here, and this is a region related to memory and trauma, in which we found actually within the trauma group, within the experiment group, to show more synchrony. And we think this is because they're actually undergoing a more kind of emotional event while watching this movie. So just kind of bring it together, I've not been able to tell you about so many things we've been doing. This is my to-do list, and I carry this around with me all the time, and both here in the PowerPoint, but also in my heart, because what we're doing here, we're doing for the survivors. So we have a learning game that they've done, and we took saliva from them that we're analyzing, and we have more brain imaging and questionnaires, and we're trying to understand what's the best way to treat these people, and how can we safeguard their mental health, their future mental health, in light of the different substances that they took to the party, But also, to be honest, many of these people are still taking a lot of substances. Some of them smoke weed every day. Some of them have become addicted to ketamine or other substances. Some of them have taken MDMA, which has been helpful for them. But because they trust us, they come back and they tell us what they're actually using. And we can actually, for the first time, I think, also monitor the relation between substance use and sometimes substance abuse and trauma. So just really to tie things up, I want to leave you with a few things. So when we monitor over months, if you remember the trajectory, expected trajectory of PTSD is that after a few months, this will go down. But this is not what we're seeing. We're seeing that PTSD symptoms within our cohort are remaining very, very high. And we think this is because the story in Israel is not yet over. I mean, the hostages are slowly coming back, but there's still many hostages there. And the war, there's a ceasefire, but the war is not over. And you can't really start healing PTSD until you've gotten to a safe place. And we're not feeling that yet, and we won't feel that until all of the hostages are back. And another thing is that social support is being reduced. People are going back to their lives in many ways, and they find it more difficult to have the patience to hold their hands and help people who are still in need. And for people who have PTSD, this is not going to go away very rapidly. So I think this is also a reminder for me and for all of us to make sure we are still empathic and remember that many people are carrying around horrific scars from what happened. But I don't want to leave you with scars, so I'll leave you with a song I love that fills me with hope. And from Emily Dickinson, so hope is a thing with feathers that perches in the soul. And it sings the tune without the words, and it never stops at all. And I really want to dedicate this to the amazing survivors and the people who didn't survive the Noah party. They're so strong and so amazing, and they've given me so much strength that I'm really proud to have a part in trying to help them. Yeah. And thank you all for your time and the many people who funded this study and helped the clinicians who helped treat these people every day and the people who, my team, who did most of the work. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Roy. I don't know if you want to stop sharing so that we can see just better.
Exactly.
And thank you to everybody who's putting questions in. This is such a rich study and such fascinating work. I really thank you for sharing it with us. I'm going to try to organize the questions together a little bit. We have a few questions that are about some more specific aspects of the experiences of the subjects of your study. One is about the substances themselves. So ketamine is not something that you spoke about very much. You spoke more about MDMA and LSD and other things. So where is it being categorized here? And did those participants have a very different experience, or is it lumped in?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I was actually asked that earlier today as well. So the thing is with ketamine is most of the people using ketamine actually mix this in with many other substances. So we were not able to really get a clear picture about the effects of ketamine per se, but only mixed in with many other substances. Yeah, so it's more difficult for us. Ketamine is actually also being used to treat depression now and off-label to treat PTSD. It has some promising results. We're quite interested in it, especially actually more in the long-term use, because we're seeing both some addiction. Ketamine is also addictive. But we're also interested if this would impact the depression rate, which is also an outcome for post-trauma. But as far as people at the party, most people do not take ketamine, but if they did, they mix this with other things.
Okay, so that actually leads to another question, which is more about the science and the analysis. The diagram that you showed of the intersecting use of all the substances makes us not envy the work that you have to do, but it raised the question also of how, whether you have a way of analyzing the effects of multiple substances at once. So when you pulled them out separately, you're seeing certain trends. Are there, for example, do you see a sign that if you combined MDMA with a psychedelic, that was a different result?
Yeah, so first of all, it's a great question. The reviewers also asked us about that. So we have a few ways of dealing with this. One thing we did is we used kind of a heuristics which we call winner takes all, right? So there's some logic that if you took LSD and you drank a beer, we're going to put you in the LSD group because the LSD kind of trumps the beer, right? So we use that kind of logic where in the clear cases, LSD is clearly more potent than the beer you had in the evening when you arrived there, and probably more potent than the weed you smoked. There's been some discussion. What we typically do is we do all the different analysis in all the different ways to make sure that we're kind of right. Basically, what we see is that people who mixed MDMA, typically they were kind of like the MDMA group. They're usually the second best group, but not as good an outcome as if people just only took MDMA, as if it was somehow a bit diluted by the other substances they took, which is typically weed. So it's not so surprising, as we see weed is probably one of the worst outcomes and MDMA is the best. So people who smoked a joint while on MDMA, it kind of diluted maybe the protective effect we're seeing.
Can you say anything about, this is another kind of questions that are getting submitted or in this realm. Can you say anything about the mechanism of how all of this is working in the brain, either scientifically, molecular level, how the brain operates, or just a little bit more about what the experience of a user of, for example, MDMA versus LSD would be experiencing, and therefore how differently, in what different way they would be processing reality than somewhere else?
Yeah, again, a great question. So I'll tell you some things which are kind of, they're difficult to grasp as science, but we've also been doing interviews with these people. So I've heard too many stories. Many people have told us that on MDMA, they felt a little bit less scared or terrified. So I think there was, the first thing is there was probably a reduction of negative affect, of negative feelings during the events. This means they actually experienced a little bit less trauma. And I'll tell one story from a person who said it's okay. So one person was on MDMA, was hiding in the bushes, and they were shooting all around him. And he saw some people getting killed. And then at some point, there was a shot, and like lots of birds, a flock of birds flew out. And he said that he felt sorry for the birds that had to suffer because of the craziness of humans. So to me, to be able to take this kind of position, which is really a kind of a universal stance, even beyond, not only, this is not a fight or flight situation. Like he was able to see beyond his own survival and see something which is beyond the self, which is a spiritual stance. And I think this was very protective for him to be able to take this kind of much wider stance. And I think this was later compounded by the fact that when they got home, the pro-social effects of MDMA allowed them to open up. Many people got home and they locked themselves into their rooms and they didn't come out for a long time. They were not able to talk to anyone. And this is maybe the worst thing to do when you've undergone trauma. I think the people who came home after an MDMA experience, they had experienced this kind of long tail effect of MDMA. They were more social. They opened up to get the love and support that their families and friends wanted to give them. So I think this is also an important part of their recovery. But for psychedelics, some people had very strong mystical experiences. Again, feeling kind of this universal spirit. And I think many of them, it's really helped them deal with the situation. Some people also said that, they were not very they didn't function well. And they were angry at themselves for not being able to function well. But when we asked the people on psychedelics how they felt about the substance during the event, they felt it was helpful. But we're actually in the outcomes, we're not seeing that these were actually helpful for the recovery, unlike MDMA. So we're not seeing that the psychedelics gave any protective effects to these people.
Fascinating, right? So the mechanism in the moment was to create a similar relief from the feeling of the threat, but not later.
Yeah, I'll throw in something else to that. I think many people also mentioned that these substances gave them energy. People ran for 12 miles, ran to save their lives. And, people who were using MDMA and also LSD, but also stimulants. This was very helpful for them to help, to be able to run. You can also maybe imagine that people who are kind of groggy on alcohol didn't do this as well. But again, I'm not going to say anything about the people who didn't make, because we don't know.
Yeah. Another sort of set of questions has to do with other differences in the experiences that might have taken place. So one about, if you even ask these questions, difference between people who attended alone versus with friends, or who, you know, had their experience of the trauma at the moment of the attack, either with people or away from people, and if you see significant gender differences.
So I'll start from the second question, because it's a very important one. There is a huge difference between genders in the response to trauma. Females are much more susceptible to post-traumatic difficulties than males. I want to say that also part of this is because society tells men that they can't talk about how they're feeling and they can't express their difficulties, and women know how to do that well. And I think that, you know, it's really a good thing for women that they are able to express these things. But there's a big gender difference in the outcomes, and we see much more PTSD symptoms in women. And that's well known. It's not only in Nova, it's everywhere in the world. So that's regarding the second part. And what was the first part?
Whether there was a difference in whether people were alone or with friends when the trauma occurred.
So generally speaking, most people were not there alone. People tend to come to these events. And we saw that the people in the MDMA group actually felt that they, even during the event, that they were more together with people. That being said, like, many people are really dispersed. And I think one of the very strong potential drivers of PTSD is survivor's guilt. So many people who escaped and their friends did not escape. You know, at this situation, there was no right thing to do. No one knew what the right thing to do. So the cops were telling people to lie on the floor and then to run away, and you ran away and you fell into a terrorist ambush. So no one really knew. It was kind of, you know, a coin flip. You ran left and you got shot. You ran right and you survived. So many people had a lot of survivor's guilt. And during the first few weeks after, we actually had very places in Israel where they congregated the people. And this was super important for them, because this is where they left their homes, often for the first time, and they saw that other people survived, and that it's okay to be a survivor.
That makes a lot of sense. I want to ask a little bit about the future. So people are asking about potential legalization or regulation for therapeutic use in the future. Can you talk, especially MDMA, which seems like the one that's the most positively correlated? What's going on there? Can you talk about what you think might happen?
Yeah. So I'm gonna take a very careful stance here, because I'm a scientist and I really believe in evidence-based medicine. So first of all, I think there's very good evidence that MDMA can be a game changer for PTSD. Okay, even unrelated to our studies. I think these studies that have been done, they've been published in great journals and they're very good. They're not perfect, but no study is ever perfect. I think MDMA could have a very, very good impact on something. You also remember that we are not good at treating PTSD with any other way. Okay, also understand the situation it is. Right now, the FDA, which was somewhat surprising to many of us, has not allowed MDMA-assisted psychotherapy to go forward, but they want more evidence. I think this is a lot because the FDA has a difficult time with having a pharmacological treatment, which is joined together with psychotherapy, right? But to be completely honest, we all know that almost all the drugs we take actually work better if we do something on ourselves, right? So the drugs we take against heart disease will actually work better if we do some sports. And definitely the SSRIs we take against depression and anxiety work better if we go to therapy. The thing is that this is not usually how pharmacological companies like to work. They like giving the drugs, and then therapy is your own issue. But we know that these work better. And I think one of the things that was difficult for the FDA to work was with the idea that you take MDMA during therapy. So the MDMA is actually assisting the therapy. But I think this is a great idea. I think this is a part of an amazing revolution that has to happen in the world of medicine. where we're actually taking the advantages that the different medicines give us and using the own things we can do with ourselves to have the synergistic relationship and get a much better outcome.
Yeah. You talk about the FDA. What about in Israel? What about the law and regulatory agencies there? Does Israel more or less follow the FDA? Or,
so typically we follow the FDA. Just to say that in Europe, at the same time that the FDA kind of said no, in Europe, they said it looks like the evidence is good and we should probably move forward with the MDMA for PTSD. In Israel, we typically follow the FDA, but we're doing a lot of clinical studies here. So we're continuing the work and doing clinical studies, including with people from the traumatic events of October 7 and the Nova population as well. I think also the study we are doing points to the idea that MDMA maybe you shouldn't wait 15 years until you have chronic PTSD, but maybe, and again, this is something we have to do a clinical trial to see, maybe you can use MDMA at a much earlier stage and avoid PTSD altogether. So this is something we're trying to look into now. Again, wow. I'll give you the answer when I have the scientific evidence and not before.
Yeah, as a kind of morning after protocol.
Yeah, I think it may, in the same way that we know that therapy is much more effective if you do it rapidly. I think maybe the same kind of intervention we're seeing helps people who've not been able to help for 15 years with PTSD. Maybe if we do this 3 months after, 4 months after, we can do much better.
Fantastic. Well, I see by Dan's appearance that we're almost out of time. I wanted to just ask quickly, a couple of people have asked for information about how they can support this work or find out more about SafeHeart. So I want to give you a chance to give a plug as you close.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. So just to say that we would love your support. We are now understanding that we have to actually contact all the people again and see how they're doing now, that maybe the situation is getting better and hopefully seeing that they'll be doing better. So I will send around, but basically we can donate to the study through the University of Haifa, and this goes all directly to our study and supporting both the survivors and the team that are doing this work. We're going to spend about $100,000 in the next 4 months to collect all these people again. So we'll be very grateful for your support.
Oh, look at that. There's a link in the chat. That's great.
Yeah, there you go. I was just going to say, put the link in the chat to the SafeHeart website. Thank you, Roy, for all this, for the work that you're doing. I think that's what we owe the most thanks for, and of course for sharing it with us. I think a lot of folks observing, there's probably difficulty to do the work as well. So hope you're taking care, you and your team, as well as you work with people deeply in need of this help. Thank you, Anne, for facilitating this conversation afterwards, and to everybody for attending and for asking such thoughtful questions. And we hope you'll join for the next couple of webinars that close out the series on the 25th of February and then the 25th of March. Thanks to our partners at Koret and Tel Aviv University and ANU, and to Brett and Diana behind the scenes for all the logistics. And I can end it, but I'll pass to Roy if you want to leave us. I'll ask you first if you want to leave us with anything. If not, I can figure something out.
Yeah, I first of all really want to thank you, because I want to say that over the past year and a half, through all this difficulty, feeling that all over the world there are people that care and support has been very important to us. Feeling not alone in all this, and it's been really, really bad, has been super important. So I want to thank you all for that.